Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is lecture 2 of the lecture series, the freebies lecture series, and the state of the art of basic income policy development. Before introducing the speaker, we're very, very happy to have Femke Roosma here with us today, but I'll introduce her in a minute. Just a very quick reminder of how the series works. So this is a public lecture series, which is part of a master's course. So this is the public part, and then with the master students, we discuss things in detail in a sort of separate occasion tomorrow, basically. The way we'll run this is that Femke, the speakers, in this case Femke, will talk for about half an hour, explaining, the article that you can find in the link in the chat, but also on the website information. And then afterwards, there will be half an hour for question and answers. Okay, the way we'll run the question and answers is just by using the hand waving button in Zoom. And please, I'm telling this now already, but I will remind you of it. Keep your questions short, because we do want to kind of optimize the time for actual discussion. I think that's really it on the background setting here. Oh yeah, just to remind you as well, one more thing. We will be recording the lecture, but we won't be recording questions and answers. Or they will be recorded, but we will cut them off. So only the lecture will be put on YouTube. So anyone who's shy, you don't have to worry about that whatsoever. So it's my pleasure to briefly introduce Femke Roosma. So Femke is assistant professor in sociology at the Tilburg University, and she's basically an expert on welfare state, social policy and welfare state, looking at a lot of social support, multidimensionality of different welfare policies, including basic income. And especially also a strong background and expertise in sort of debates around deservingness, which of course is a key feature of basic income as well. This particular paper is much more on sort of political economy, very focused on the Netherlands, but with very novel methodology and really, really interesting findings. And without further ado, Femke, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jurgen, and thank you for having me and being able to share the article and talk about the article. I will share my screen to put it up here, the PowerPoint presentation. And I think this will be also shared later on with you guys. So I'm going to talk about an article that is part of a bigger project, actually a PhD project of Erwin Gielens. And this article is called Between Left and Right, a Discourse Network Analysis of Universal Basic Income on Dutch Twitter. And as I said, this is part of a bigger project that has resulted in a PhD thesis that will be defended by Erwin Gielens in June. So several articles have come out of it, and in general this PhD thesis talks about mapping the UBI debate, like the public debate on the one hand and public support on the other hand, and trying to also make the link between those, and it's focusing on the Dutch situation. But this particular article looks at the public debate, and I will try to contextualize a little bit before I will go into the specifics of the article. But this is just to give credits to the first author, and Erwin is also very much an expert in this, but I'm happy to share the article with you here. So to give it a little bit of context, I think this article can be placed in a series of articles talking about the legitimacy of welfare state policies, and then in particular UBI policies, or policy proposal, I must say. And I think that there are two strains of literature in this type of research. First, studies that focus on popular support for UBI, and this is of course important studies because it looks at the conditions for possible implementation of UBI. So on the one hand, studies look at support for UBI in general, among the general population, among subgroups within the population. But more recently, we see also more articles focusing on different elements of UBI and support for different elements of UBI. So, for instance, do people support its unconditionality or its redistributive aims, or what kind of funding of UBI do people see? And I think that in this lecture series, Tim Flandas and Leire Rincon will also talk about this legitimacy of UBI, of public support, and these different elements. Another strain of literature focuses more on the public debate itself. And I think this public debate is also relevant to look into, because political actors organize to give arguments and to debate the public and to debate this issue in the public arena and see whether or not it can obtain support or not. And this public debate is also relevant for legitimizing the UBI proposal. And we see that there are several studies focusing on framing in this UBI in the public debate. So which kind of arguments are used to introduce UBI, or which arguments are used against UBI. And some other studies also contain, for instance, narrative accounts of a coalition formation around pro and con arguments for UBI. So, for instance, why is the trade unions are opposing UBI, or why are certain political parties supporting UBI, and with what kind of arguments actually. However, these are not really connected yet. So in this article, we contribute to this second strain of literature, so the public debate literature. And we try to not focus only on the arguments, so what kind of arguments, what kind of framing, but also how coalitions use the arguments, and which arguments are central to the debate, and which arguments are not central to the debate. And I think that in this article, we use quite a novel method to assess this. I will go on to this in a minute. A theoretical angle in this is discursive institutionalism. So discursive institutionalism looks into the role of ideas in institutional change, and it mentions that policy proposals are framed in line with a certain ideology or certain convictions to build coalitions and mobilize support among constituencies. And in this debate, in this framing of certain policy proposals, there's a certain struggle for framing and interpretation. So there are ways to credit and discredit policy proposals, and success of implementing or success of legitimizing a policy proposal, in this case UBI, depends on the type and combination of arguments used on the one hand, but also, of course, on the coalitions that support these arguments. And in this article, we try to look at both. So both these combinations of arguments and the coalitions that support these arguments for UBI. And I think that in the UBI debate, or in the literature, actually there are two main perspectives that look at UBI as a certain policy proposal. The first perspective is mentioned by a lot of proponents of UBI, and they argue that a universal basic income is beyond left and right. So they would argue that UBI is in potential an interesting policy proposal because it's able to unite central fractions in welfare politics. So, for instance, on the one hand, it's argued that UBI is able to secure income, protect against exploitation, which is really an argument coming from the left, from socialist side, for instance. Well, on the other hand, UBI is able to give people individual freedom and facilitates entrepreneurship, which is really an argument from the liberal side. And more recently, also arguments are that the UBI could promote work and social participation, also by removing disincentives from the current welfare system, which really fits into the social investment approach. I'm sorry. So it's able to, so it can be everything, right? So it's a beyond left and right proposal, which can make a lot of people from different political angles very happy. So it can attract support from across the political spectrum. On the other hand, actually, some, and Jurgen is one of them, have argued or have noticed that UBI can either depends really on what kind of UBI you have, whether it's left or right. So, for instance, UBI and the effects of UBI really depends on the level, the replacement of existing benefits, also its funding type. So the effects can be very different. So some would argue for a certain type of UBI which can be seen left, for instance, with a general level, with a little replacement of existing benefits, really topping up the social security system as we know it, or right, like with removing all other types of benefit with a lower level, and also depending on the funding system, of course. So that's why UBI also have been opposed by some unlikely coalition of, on the one hand, trade unions who say this will be a right-wing proposal which will cut down the welfare system, or by liberal conservatives who fear that there will be much more redistribution and see UBI as a very expensive socialist proposal. So in that sense, UBI has many faces. And what we do is now analyze the debate and look at the arguments for and against UBI in the debate. So the first aim would be to describe these arguments. Which arguments are now used in the actual debate among people? Okay, this is Twitter, so that's a limitation. Maybe we'll talk about it later, but which arguments are there in the actual debate? And second, we try to find which arguments unite and divide proponents and opponents in this debate, and see whether arguments are used in conjunction. So do people use many arguments from different political or ideological backgrounds? So this beyond left or right, beyond left and right thesis, or do people use arguments in isolation? So that would be the many faces hypothesis, so to say. And in this sense, we are able to map the broader interpretations of UBI in the actual debate. And finally, we try to examine which arguments and interpretations are endorsed by political elites, also to look at these coalitions and the political coalitions behind this argument formation. So really looking at the political debate, the arguments which are central in the debate, and how can they unite and divide people along a certain interpretation of UBI. And this is like summing up the expectations that we have. So on the one hand, you could see that you could expect that in the debate, there's a beyond left and right reasoning, which would lead to a substantive position in which discussants tend to frame UBI as a combination of socialist, liberal, and social investment policies. So UBI has it all. And the elite endorsement then would be that political representatives from different party families would endorse this policy. So it will be endorsed by the left and the right. While this many faces perspective, so to say, or hypothesis would be that discussants tend to frame UBI exclusively as a left-wing proposal or socialist proposal or right-wing proposal, or maybe a social investment proposal. Do not combine these arguments, which will lead to political representative of different parties endorsing different types of arguments. And then we have the many faces hypothesis. So getting into the data and methods, as the title mentions, we look at Twitter data, and we look at Twitter data in 2014 to 2015. And we do this because it is a reflection of an actual debate. So there's really a discussion between people. So there are replies on tweets, and a lot of arguments are shared. And we think it's suitable for our analysis because the topic of UBI was really debated on Dutch Twitter after some real life events. So there was a documentary on television, and after that there were big Twitter debates, and this UBI debate went viral and was one of the trending topics, so to say. So also a lot of politicians joined this discussion. So you had regular people, but also politicians joining in, which is, I think, very interesting to look also about, look also into this, coalitions and political coalitions. So these were our reasons to use this Twitter data. And we selected these by using, of course, looking at the keyword of basic income. And we selected tweets up to 9 replies to every initial tweet. So capturing really broad discussion among people. And we purposely selected tweets to acknowledge the event-centered nature of social media. So there were several days, and I will show this in a minute in a graph, where UBI was debated a lot, and in other days it was less. So we selected all tweets posted on 3 days in which this topic was really trending, and it's resulted in over 5,000 tweets of almost more than 1,300 users. So here you can see all the tweets about UBI on Dutch Twitter between 2012 and 2018, and you can really see that there are like four or five peaks. First, related to a documentary that was aired on Dutch television about UBI, and also the Swiss referendum was there. And then there was also a specific policy proposal to introduce trust or UBI experiments, which was also very much debated. So we selected 3 of them because we didn't use the Swiss referendum because we wanted to focus on the Dutch situation. And thought that these 3 capture a real debate about UBI. To get the names of the political representatives, we went to Polytwoops, which was a website which is not currently active, but mapping tweets, deleted tweets of politicians. So they have a database of political representatives from all levels of government, and they obtained us with the data of these political representatives, and we found that there were 49 political representatives in the sample tweeting about basic income in this period, 17 Greens, 9 Socialists, etc., etc. And they sent over 200 tweets in total, and this is a little more than average for participants in this debate. And we found that liberals, conservatives, and labor politicians were underrepresented, while the Greens and socialists were overrepresented in this Twitter debate. And then when we look at the unit of observation, so what are we now actually analyzing? And we analyzed a claim. So that is a positive or a negative reference to the UBI concept made by an actor. So for instance, we have a tweet, and this can contain several claims about UBI. So several concepts were coded out of this tweet, up to 3. And these concepts were also coded in position. So some reference can be positive. So for instance, I will show an example in a minute. So several references can be positive, several references can be negative or neutral. So, and we found 56 unique concepts that were used in this debate. And I will show you in a minute what we found. So there were also some tweets, of course, with no arguments, which were coded in the rest category. So this can be spam or, I don't know, advertisements or all kinds of things you find on Twitter that were not relevant for the debate, but also tweets with no argument given. So the intercoder reliability was also checked. We found that this was okay. So we coded this by hand. This is like part of the descriptives actually. Here you can find the most debated concepts in a positive way or in a negative reference, so to say. So for instance, the experiment was the most debated topic, so and also mostly positive, as you can see. But also deregulation, using UBI as a tool to deregulate the welfare system was also often debated more positively than negatively. And then also free riding, in the sense that negatively would be negative for UBI and positive would be people claiming that there's no free riding on UBI affordability. So these are among the most debated topics. It's just frequencies. And you can see 32 concepts, and we excluded in this graph the arguments with less than 1% of mentions. So in the next step, we try to combine the analysis of frames and actors. So this discursive network analysis connects actors based on their disagreements across various arguments. And this, I will take you through this in several steps. So the first step is we use a program R constructing a network of agreement relations between participants in the debate based on information from the content analysis. So this can be positive relations, so people agreeing on the same argument. It can also be negative relations, so disagreement on the same argument. And the stronger, the more concept that participants agree on, the stronger the relationship. So I will show an example in the next slide. So we construct this network, and participants that tend to agree are assigned to the same cluster. So we obtain a clustering procedure where people are put in the same cluster if they tend to agree on certain arguments, and if they disagree, they are, of course, in another cluster. And this way we try to identify several clusters of people supporting or opposing UBI or certain arguments in the debate. And then finally, the discursive position of each cluster is then identified by plotting the argument frequencies per cluster. So first we obtain these clusters, and then we look at the arguments used in these clusters. And we also identify which politicians are in which clusters. So this sounds very abstract, and I think helps to see the results to understand what is happening here. So first, how does this network analysis look? It's basically very simple. So you have like two users, for instance, user A and user B, who debate UBI. First, they discuss a concept of deregulation. So user A would say, and this is an actual tweet, so basic income is great. It's time to get rid of the hassle with supplements and deductions. So this user A is really in favor of UBI because there's too much bureaucracy now to redistribute benefits. While the opponent says, maybe I'm missing something, but UBI seems to me even more needless, redistributing and taxing. So it's really an argument with regard to deregulation, but then negative about UBI. Then with regard to poverty, user A would say, how hard can it be to solve poverty with a universal basic income? And we also looked at the context of this tweet. So this was a very positive reference to UBI, although it's a question. And then user B would argue that with UBI, people that cannot work end up in poverty with a negative reference. So these two users have a quite strong connection because they debate on the same topics, but this connection is negative because they disagree upon UBI and specifically on certain arguments. So this is a strong but negative relationship. So we mapped then all these relationships and looked at clustering. And in this map, you find agreement ties only. So ties with strengths greater than the threshold of 0.60 are mapped. And you can see that the nodes that are there show that there are 4 big clusters. So we found 8 clusters, but there were also some very, very small clusters. So they were disregarded. So we found 4 big clusters. And the stronger the nodes and the fact that they are closer together means a very integrative agreement coalition. So you can see here that there's light green nodes, and this is a cluster debating the experiment. So they're very much in favor of an experiment. So they do not really engage with substantive arguments. So they very much disagree on this experiment, and that's why they're very cohesive and integrative. And we also find 3 other clusters. First, one of proponents of the UBI, which are here with the lighter brown nodes, and here with the more darker brown nodes. I'm not sure what these colors are, but are the opponents. And then finally, we find also some political promoters. So four main clusters, and we find that this polarization between proponents and opponents is not very extreme, so there's some overlap. So they're all over the map, so to say, but for the experiment group, it's very clear. So to see what is in this cluster, we've looked at the frequencies, so the frequencies of concepts that were used in this cluster, and then we found in the proponent cluster that they combine arguments from socialist, liberal, and social investment discourse. So you can, for instance, see here in this heat map that green cells indicate agreement with the concept, while red cells indicate disagreement with the concept. And you can see that they use arguments from like different types of concepts. So it's about well-being, it's about security, it's about freedom. So they're really putting forward this beyond left and right arguments by using arguments from different discourses. And they clearly reject the free riding claim. And that's not really clear here, but you can see this here in this redistributive white cell, which indicates silence or ambivalence regarding a topic, that they're not very clear about whether or not what are the redistributive implications of UBI. So will UBI retrench or expand the welfare state? So the opponent cluster, they share that UBI is unrealistic and infeasible, and that's unfair to the working population. But they, of course, are much divided in the interpretations of UBI. So some find it very socialist, left-wing, and others are afraid that it's will lead to welfare retrenchment. So here you see this many faces approach among the opponents. Now, well, the experiment promoters is very clear. They promote the experiment, but they don't use very substantive arguments. And the political promoters try to actively engage politicians to promote UBI, but they also do not really use substantive arguments. So they try to get politicians into the debate. And then finally, the position, or not finally, but with regard to the substance, the positions of the arguments, we find that affordability is central in the debate. So a lot of people are debating affordability, and neither opponents nor proponents nor opponents dominate this argument. So it's used by both, and it also emphasizes the redistributive and clarity in the discussion. So is it affordable? Will it be a massive leading to massive redistribution or not? It's very unclear, and it also has results to the relation to the affordability, of course. Then, interestingly, I think we see a lot of social investments arguments central in the debate. So, for instance, activations, deregulation, participation, well-being are all like here and debated a lot by proponents. And they are very well connected also by proponents. So they do a very well job putting the social investment discourse central in the debate. And proponents really also try to build a coherent case of UBI beyond left or right, and trying to connect central arguments from across the discourse to argue for UBI. And at the same time, they also actively engage with the counter arguments of the opponents, while the opponents focus mostly on the unaffordability and the unrealistic concerns for the needy and free riding. So I think this is interesting. It says something about where the argument is about, or what the debate is about, and what are the arguments central. And then when we look at the actor endorsements, we see that proponents, so this is proponents, it says liberal egalitarian, but the proponents are especially from the green left and also the socialists. And the green left politicians are also the most active in promoting the experiment. So this is really what we know also from the other literature on political endorsement of UBI. And the opponents are mainly liberals and conservatives, which is also not a surprise. And the socialists, and this is also not a surprise, are strongly divided. So you find socialists among the opponents and also among the proponents of UBI. So it really splits the political left, so to say. And Democratic politicians are mostly active as the political promoters, but that is more Dutch context thing. So yeah, political positions remain largely stable, and it's really not beyond left and right. It's really the main conclusions that we draw earlier also from political analysis of UBI. So then conclusions. So we find that proponents defend UBI as beyond left and right with a cohesive set of arguments. And I think this is very interesting. They place social investment discourse as central in the debate. And I think that also Yannick van der Borgt will talk in this lecture series, which is coming up next, I think, about this social investment and the relation with UBI. So I think it's interesting that it also pops up in the debate among the proponents of UBI on Twitter. Opponents then frame UBI as a policy with many faces, so either a form of welfare retrenchments or a form of welfare expansion. And proponents do not really argue against it with a unified counter-argument. So they are largely ambivalent about redistributive implications of UBI. They don't really talk about it, or they have different opinions about it. So that's why they do not really have a counter-argument against the opponents who really try to frame it either as a socialist thing or as a right-wing proposal. So finally, we find that political support is very stable. So again, green left proponents, liberal conservative opponents, and divided socialists. So presenting UBI as beyond left and right does not generate support from the political right, and it divides actually the political left, which is a concern, I think, for promoters of universal basic income. So in general, we see that frames change in this UBI debate, but political coalitions remain the same. And then maybe, like, finally to end, before I look forward to the discussion and your questions, maybe two limitations, which are maybe also very obvious. First, Twitter, is it representative of a real debate? No, it is not. So there are, of course, different types of users, different types of arguments used. Also, we have this role of algorithms, influencers, audience amplification dynamics that center some arguments over others. So coalition formation can be, of course, very different in other political arenas. And then the Dutch context is also, of course, leading. So arguments in coalitions can differ in different contexts. And the Netherlands is maybe a little bit particular because UBI is a well-debated proposal that has some history in Dutch political context. So it might be that arguments are more developed here, or some things are more well-known. I'm not sure, but it's focused only on the Netherlands. So these are some limitations. And I look forward to your questions, and thank you for listening. Sorry, Jurgen, you're on mute.
Sorry, I punched and punched again. So thanks very much, Femke. That was really, really interesting.